For every TCG there's a time when the metagame kinda turns into Clown Fiesta. In Hearthstone, for example, this time would probably be when the Demon Seed was meta. Where instead of hitting your opponent really hard, you just hit yourself really hard until your opponent died. I don't know too much about Magic, but I've seen a YouTube video where somebody builds a PC using Magic cards, and if you're able to build a PC using Magic cards, you're probably able to do some wild shit in the game.
We have technology!
But there's one group of guys that survive even the worst metagames, and this group of people is the Yu-Gi-Oh community. Since even if Yu-Gi-Oh is in a healthy state, for most other TCG players the game still looks like the biggest clown fiesta. But there definitely were some wild metagames, like for example in 2018 when the entire year had one certain monster that made many metas worse than they should have been. Or in 2020, in the Hulk Aerodon format with Infernoble and Dragonlink or Emancipator and Synchro Eldritch. You can say that the Yu meta can be as bad as it wants to be, but people will still play the game because they just love the game. But it wasn't always like this, because there was one time where the meta was like really bad and people were really pissed about the game, and the game almost died because of this. And the year when this happened was in 2012. In 2012, not only did people put videos on YouTube where they pretend to have a seizure, or the world was about to end if you listen to the Mayas.
The world might end, but I still need my playset Ultimate Effect Veiler.
Also on the 19th of January, Order of Chaos was released into the TCG. And in this set there were basically two important things. First of all, Inzektors were released, and also Wind Up got new support that was crazy good. But to see the issue with those two archetypes, we need to go back a bit and see what the metagame looked before those two archetypes. The metagame before Wind Up mostly consists of decks like Tengu plans that would use Reborn Tengu to accelerate in synchro summons. On turn 2. Hero Beat, a deck that could pop and draw one card with Gemini Spark. Or Chaos Agents, a deck that could summon threatening monsters, like for example Gachi Gachi Gatetsu. You just needed to play at least two drivers in form of the Shining Balls. The only deck released prior to Wind Up on Inzektor that could compete with those two decks was Dino Rabbit. A deck that would tribute Rescue Rabbit to summon Dolka or Lagia on turn 1. You just need to play like 6 drivers for the Rescue Rabbit to be alive. And for the exception of Dino Rabbit, no older deck could really compare to those decks like Wind Up, a deck that could theoretically loop your entire hand turn 1 and enter a monster that's equally as strong as SP, at least back then, Wind Up Sand Mates. And trust me, it was $100. Or a deck that could just nuke away the entire body setup turn 1 while setting up Sand Mates. And trust me, the card really was crazy. Not only were Wind Up and Inzektor way more explosive than those older decks, but they also had way better follow-up. Wind Up, for example, could just activate a factory, summon their own rabbit, and yeet it away every turn if it gets threatened, and every time you yeet it away, you get one surge. And it's kinda crazy because you even get a surge during your opponent's turn. And because the rabbit could just yeet itself away every turn, it was pretty hard to deal with this rabbit, while getting the surges. And for Inzektors, the Centipede could just search another Dragonfly for the follow-up, so it could just do the entire play again on the next turn. While modern players are kinda used to such combo turns or crazy explosive turns, players back then were not.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
And since players back then were used to a way slower game and a way slower format, most people really didn't like those two new decks. Some people definitely did. For me, example, I really liked Inzektor and I also enjoyed Wind Up, but like for most people, it was just too much. But there's one thing that Yu-Gi-Oh players can always prey upon, and that being our Lord and Savior, the Banlist. Since the Banlist could just simply put those two decks in check, and probably also Dino Rabbit, and all the older decks could be playable again. So when the balance arrived for the 1st of March 2012, people were really excited. But what people got was probably one of the worst banlists of all time. Except maybe for the COVID banlist. For certain reasons. The reason for that being that the only decks that got hit on the banlist were decks that were released before Order of Chaos. The only card that got hit that was played in decks like Wind Up and Inzektor was Trap Dust Shoot, and it was just in general a toxic card for the game. Everything else, like for example Trishula, Bulb, Spore, TG Striker, Earth, Tengu, all were specific hits to Tengu plant format decks. Funny enough, Inzektor probably only got stronger after this list because Call of the Haunted went to 3 and Inzektor really liked to play Call of the Haunted. But Sheer and Smoke Signal went to 2, and so maybe 6Ms could now compete with those two archetypes. Funny enough, I think 6Ms did really well at 1 YCS in this format. People now were just really annoyed, since decks that were already too weak to compete with Wind Up and Inzektor were just even weaker, and people were forced to play Wind Up and Inzektor and Dino Rabbit. And the players didn't even know why Konami did this, and since we know Konami, they would never explain their hits. Right? Well, Except this time, because for this banlist Konami suddenly decided to explain their hits on the banlist in a blog post. And let's say, their reasons were not the best reasons. But before Konami explained why they hit certain cards, they first of all explained why there is a banlist in general. The first reason was that in 2003 the most decks contained of 23 similar cards, and so if you didn't play those cards you had a huge disadvantage, so they wanted such cards that every deck could play. Another reason was that you shouldn't be forced to play certain cards or certain decks. They also want to avoid to have only one deck that's way too powerful. I mean, you have 3. Or to restrict solitaire decks. I see an issue there. But yeah, they also gave their reasoning for the changes on the ban list. Some explains were fine, like Trapdoor's Shoot is just a broken one-off, sucks mid-game, so it's just an unfun card to play with. Or Smoke Signal and Lumina, where the reason mostly is that the decks kinda sucked. Other cards had a more interesting explanation, for example Bulb and Spore. The reason for those hits mainly was that generic tuners that can be accessed easily that have no cost to summon themselves were just way too good and they wanted to restrict them in some way. I think they wanted to hit Hulk a little bit early there. The reason for TG Striker and Earth was basically the decks are good in the OCG, so we want to hit them here a bit early. But there's a small issue with this reasoning, and that's that both Dolka and Wind Up Shark both were TCG exclusives, so the OCG wasn't even able to play those cards. So not only were people forced even more to play Wind Up, Inzektor and Dino Rabbit, but also the decks got murdered with bad reasonings. And to make things even worse, back then there were only 2 banlists in a year, so you needed to wait half a year to hope that Wind Up and Inzektor finally die. And with that reasoning, many people quit the game at that point and just didn't want to play against Inzektor, Wind Up and Dino Rabbit anymore. But on the 26th of March, there was a thing that was able to save Yugioh, kinda. And that was the 100th YCS. Not only was it the biggest YCS ever with 4,000 plus players, but also the deck that won the event was not Wind Up, was not Inzektor, and was not Dino Rabbit, it was Dark World. And it was really cool for the game, because people loved Dark World back then, and so seeing Dark World, not a meta deck at all, winning a YCS that's that big, put faith into the heart of people. There were also some other decks that were able to compete with Wind Up and Inzektor, for example Chaos Dragons that could abuse Future Fusion, since this card was still legal for some reason, but even though it gave players hope, still many people quit during this time of the game. On the 1st of September though, things finally changed, since a new banlist went into effect. And Wind Up and Inzektor were finally hit. With Hornet and Dragonfly going to 1, the deck was just way more inconsistent, and also you couldn't use Dragonfly more than once. At least you couldn't search another Dragonfly if you used Dragonfly turn 1. And for Wind Up, with Zanmadi going to 1, you couldn't perform the hand loop anymore. Chaos Dragons also got a hit with Future Fusion getting banned and Red MD going to 1. Dino Rabbit got a small hit with Rescue Rabbit going to 2, but since Rescue Rabbit was the most important card of the deck, it was definitely fine, since now we played 6 Garnets for 2 good cards. In general, the list was gigantic with 30 different changes. But there was one big issue with this ban list, and that was that Shockmaster was not on the list. But in defense of Konami, they couldn't ban the card because of a certain reason, and that was that Shockmaster was a jump promo. For those who don't know, back then Konami released many cards as shown jump promos, but only in America. They continued printing cards as jump promos until 2018, and often cards would be insanely strong. For example, Stratos was a jump promo, Link Creeper was a jump promo, and also Summon Sorceress was a jump promo. The biggest issue there was that European players were not really able to get their hands on such cards, and so they were not allowed to play with those cards. So if Konami would ban a card like Shockmaster before European players were even able to play with those, it would be really weird. But it just sucks for the American players, because they would be forced to play with those cards for longer times and need to indulge these cards for longer times, just because European players were not able to play with those. And since Wind Up could still abuse Shockmaster, Wind Up was still the best deck using just a Shocklock. But since you could compete against a card like Shockmaster by simply playing many good trap cards, it wasn't the end of the world. But similar to VFD, it's still not fun being forced to play trap decks, but often the game gets slower because of this, and for that reason often also gets a little bit more fun. There were also some new releases, like for example Mermail was released and also Firefist was released, and both decks were really competent. So the metagame at least was a bit more refreshing than looking at Wind Up and Inzektor doing the same stuff over and over again. And on the 1st of March 2013, the reign of Wind Up would finally end with the banning of Zanmadi, that till this day stays on the ban list. And from this day on, Wind Up would never see competitive play again, and both decks that almost destroyed the game were now completely dead. To be honest, I don't really hate Inzektor or Wind Up. I really like both archetypes. They just were way too good for their time in the TCG, and people couldn't really handle the power creep at that time. And I kinda feel like Konami is scared of printing new support for both archetypes, since the only support both decks got since 2013 were the Link Rain Spec monsters, and Inzektor also got the Create a Card project card. And maybe the only reason Inzektor got a card was because round 1 they lost against the bot, and yeah. Or people seem to just really like Inzektors. But in general, I'd love to see some good support for those archetypes, because it would be interesting to see how those decks could compete in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I think most cards are actually not too bad. Like for example, Shark would still be a really good extender, and Dragonfly and Centipede could be really crazy in general, because their effects not hard runs per turn, and I think they're in general not even soft runs per turn. It's just kinda hard to equip multiple cards to one monster, and pop those. But yeah, that was my video on windups and inzektors. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like. If you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing to my channel. And yeah, then I'd say see you in the next video.